And then lastly, evaluate many countries have balance of trade deficit with China. President Trump, of course, has in the last 4 years been trying to reduce the extent to which the US has that enormous trade deficit with China. Evaluate one protectionist method and one other. Okay, so before we answer the question, Jonathan, let's have a few policies that a government could introduce in order to reduce down the size of a trade deficit. There are a number, but give me one. Okay. And what is that? Tax on imports, okay. 2. Subsidize domestic industry. Yep. So rather than sort of tackling the foreign economy, tackle it in your domestic economy by making your own domestic goods more competitive, more price competitive. And in that way, people will decide to buy domestic goods, not imported foreign goods. So subsidize domestic industries. Yep. What about currency? Okay, so you could actively intervene in the FOREX, which is the FOREX is the foreign exchange market. Thank you. You could actively intervene, or the central bank could actively intervene in the foreign exchange market and try to get the currency to depreciate, Jonathan? Yeah, no, why would that work? And your exports will also be, in terms of price, will be cheaper, yeah. So the depreciation, as you rightly say, would put the price of the imports up, and then hopefully you might demand fewer imports, in theory. Now, what theory did we look at last year which suggests that that might happen, but it'll take a bit of time to cure a trade deficit? What was the theory we looked at last year? To do with the letter of the alphabet? The J curve. So that, all of that is to do with the J curve effect. We're not going to go over that now, but yeah, that's something which it directly relates to. Okay, Jonathan, got any other up your sleeve for protectionism? Quotas, yep, absolutely. And what is that, Saffron? So it's a physical limit on the number of goods stroke services that you can bring into an economy, and it makes the supply curve perfectly inelastic. Correct. And the diagram for a quota. So there's your price, like so. And that is obviously the market equilibrium price, but you then impose a quota, and it's maybe a physical limit S2, and so now the price goes up, and so you demand fewer. Demand Q2 instead of Q star. Imports. Any others? Protectionist policies. So what's it called when you just put a total ban on goods coming in? an embargo. So an embargo, which it's not really a protectionist policy because there's then no trade happening, but an embargo is a total ban. So it would be sort of or maybe against a country like North Korea or Iran or places like that, you would say, well, we're not going to have any of your goods because we don't want to give you any money, contribute to your economy. Right, okay, so Alana, which policy did you choose for this one? Subsidy, okay, so did you draw a subsidy diagram? Did you highlight on the diagram the cost of the subsidy to the government? Okay, so that's something which is often left off, these subsidy diagrams. So what happens when you introduce the subsidy? Supply shifts to the right. So you start P1, Q1, introduce subsidy. There you go. P2, Q2. Now the cost of that subsidy is what? And now let me just add a couple of points here, Jonathan. A and B. Up from B, because we know that the vertical distance between the two curves, Megan, is the size of the subsidy. S1 to S plus subsidy. So the distance between the vertical distance between the two parallel curves is the size of the subsidy. And how many units are being subsidized, not Q1 to Q2. So the often mistake here is that people take this rectangle here as the cost of the subsidy, but it's actually B to C to P3 to P2. That rectangle is the size of the subsidy, and often missed out or added, but added in the wrong place. So Megan, that's the same as if you did S and then S plus tax. Obviously the vertical distance is the size of the tax, so it's the same thing but in reverse. Okay, Alana, sorry you didn't finish off there, so you're saying that that'll be effective because?
Because it decreases the price, so people are more likely to buy domestic goods from like local shops and industries rather than importing other goods, as the price is probably higher.
Okay. Now that, ladies and gents, that is known as an import substitution policy. So you're trying to get people to switch from imports to buying your domestic good. So that's known as import substitution. Now some economies in recent years have grown because they've had this kind of import substitution growth strategy. How would you describe China's growth strategy? Export-led, exactly. So theirs has very much been on the back of export-led growth. Okay, Alana, weaknesses or evaluation of a subsidy policy?
It depends on the elasticity of demand, as well as some places such as like...
Okay, yeah. So, if the elasticity of demand was like so, even if you introduce an absolute whopper of a subsidy, S1 down to S plus sub, you won't actually sell that many more goods. You're only going to go Q1 to Q2. So it'd be very costly and not much benefit. So obviously you would want it to be much more elastic. Okay, another point?
There are places like China, for example, who are export-led and their prices might be lower even with large subsidies just because they're so much more efficient and good at what they do compared to the UK.
And the labour is much cheaper, and they've got lots of raw materials on their doorstep, So yes, even if you introduce a subsidy, you still might not be able to compete, correct? Or you might find that inflation in the UK is rampant, and so even though the price drops because of the subsidy, it just shoots up again because of the inflationary pressures. So all sorts of different things you could write for that. Jonathan, which policy did you choose? Okay, what's the diagram for that? In reverse. Okay. Now, there is a much more complicated tariff diagram. Is that the one? Have you drawn that?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So that'll be what you're looking at, which is that. Yeah? Okay. It would take too long now to get into that. But that's a possibility. The premise is the same, price goes up, and so you demand fewer imports. That's all from the import side of things. What? So you drew that one?
Yeah.
And what did you say about the weaknesses of a tariff?
I said that once they're put in place, they're quite hard to remove, so it could like kind of ruin the whole plan that they had, because it's really hard to like get imports in once they.
Why are they hard to remove?
I wasn't sure. I used the textbook, but I wasn't too sure.
I mean, I would think if you were the government, you could, unless you were in some sort of EU-wide agreement. So if you're kind of locked into that sort of thing, then you can't just willy-nilly, independently have your own trade policy because you've signed up to a greater trade policy than that. Yes.
I said that it, like the American versus China, there can be a lot of retaliation from the
Thank you. That is the big problem. Is if I impose a tariff on you, no, I impose one on you, you will then, right, and so you get this kind of retaliation all the time. So I introduce 10% tariff on you, then you introduce 12 on me, then I come back at you. And so you get into a trade war, right? So you'll know those terms, I hope. Price war. So what market structure is that associated with? Thank you. And then when you're talking trade wars, we're talking this retaliatory type of thing. You could say the same of subsidies, of course. So if I introduce a subsidy, you might say, well, if anything you can do, I can do better, and I'll introduce a subsidy as well. Okay, what did you have as your policy? Subsidy, tariff. Okay. Yeah, I mean, they do tend to be the common ones, obviously. If you had chosen the exchange rate, then your evaluative point would be the J-curve, to say that these effects are not instantaneous and it might take some time for the change in the relative value of the currency to feed through to the proper marketplace. Right, okay.
you know, if you had chosen the subsidy one, could you said that your domestic industries could end up being very dependent on government intervention?
Yes, absolutely. So it's difficult. So to wean them off a subsidy is kind of like a drug addict coming off drugs. Yeah, it's very, very difficult. Yeah. And we had this problem in this country in the sort of 60s and 70s, where the big car companies were getting big subsidies, and then it was very, very difficult to kind of wean them off those. They suffered from, withdrawal, really. Right, was that the last question I asked you to do in that? Yeah. Right. Okay. For the time being, that is. Okay, so let's now, unless there are any more questions on that. Okay, let's move to the paper on Zambia.